Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to ISE 318, the InnerSource Express on the journey to Frankfurt. My name is Carsten Hoffmann, and I would like to welcome you to my presentation. I wish you a pleasant journey. So let's get started with a little comic. It says, "What a neat thingy. I need that thingy. I'll invent one. It'll do all the same stuff, but it'll be completely different." And I'm sure most of you know the not invented here syndrome, which this is trying to describe. And I'm going to get started with a little bit of context of where I am coming from, or rather where we are coming from at Deutsche Bahn. We have a large software development organization. We have more than 50,000 active Git repositories in a central GitLab instance, which consists of more than 13,000 GitLab groups, more than 10,000 users in GitLab, and more than 450 million lines of code. Actually, these numbers are about a year old, so it's probably grown since then. And I think a very interesting number is we have 22% of InnerSource share of those Git projects. And here, InnerSource is just the definition that source code is available for everyone in the DB to read, not saying anything about the license that it's under. Yeah, at that point, kudos to the team that runs this GitLab instance. It's basically the brain of our software development. Really important that it works well, and it does. There are also some Azure DevOps and other smaller decentralized instances, but for the purpose of what we're doing, they are not really relevant for the InnerSource context. I have a timeline of InnerSource here. The first mention of InnerSource, not in the term InnerSource, but finding a project where basically the principles of InnerSource were applied, is 1999 for the introduction of Java. And in 2002, there was the start of a component library that was called Colt in CVS 2002. So this was the first actual library that was shared in an InnerSource manner. In 2006, the management issues an order to publish DB Systel internal projects as InnerSource. So the DB Systel is the IT partner of the Deutsche Bahn Group. The Deutsche Bahn Group has more than 200,000 employees, and the DB Systel has about 7,000 of those. And in 2011, I would say there was a peak of InnerSource, because there was a 6-week workshop where they worked on different libraries within Colt, and a lot of that developed in that time. Then, 2016, GitLab and Artifactory were selected as repositories for InnerSource project, and that was also the start of the agile transformation that the DB Systel did. So we were a hierarchical organization, and now we were moving to a more network-oriented organization. And why is that important for InnerSource? It's important because something that happened in 2006, a direct order from top to down, doesn't really work in a network organization. Of course, still somebody could say, we want to do InnerSource, but you'll need to find different answers, and also you have different problems if you're in a network organization. I joined in 2017. I am a software architect working full-time in a DevOps team, but part-time I am part of the InnerSource topic team, which I joined 2021. That is part of the architecture guild of the DB Systel, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. Just to make sure that we're on the same page, this is, of course, an experience report of my own experience, and I hope it's useful for you, but maybe not, because obviously contexts differ. So let's get started to talk about InnerSource. And I have written down why we want to do InnerSource. And I've identified 4 main quality points. The first is that we want to promote the culture of collaboration. And culture of collaboration is something that you see in the open source world, working together across projects, across teams, across countries. And this is what we want as well for the Deutsche Bahn. And so doing InnerSource really pays into that. We want to do cost reduction, which is probably the first thing that comes into mind if you talk about InnerSource, reuse of software libraries, or also parts of the software by copying code and adapting it. We want to increase quality through feedback in the form of issues and merge requests and better insights into already existing innovative solutions to have a low barrier to building on what already exists. And last but not least, the transparency, more transparency about the work in projects, but also in governance organizations and in the community as a whole. So now the question is, why don't we just do it if it's so great? I could, just end my talk and now say InnerSource is a good thing, we all do it, and ta-da. But it's not that simple. And we have discovered three main impediments. And this was back in 2021 when we founded the topic team. And we're going to just jump straight into the first one, which is we are separate business enterprises. At the Deutsche Bahn Group, we have about 500 subsidiaries, which are their own legal entities. So this makes it really, really hard to share code, or without the proper things in place, it makes it virtually impossible. And each and their own project needs to take care of all the regulatory aspects themselves. And so since this is a big impediment, we have come up with a solution, and it's our own software license, the DB InnerSource license. Let's take a look at it, and now we can just read through the license one by one. We have quite enough time. Okay, that was a joke. We're not going to do that because that license is written by lawyers for lawyers, right? Of course, other people were involved, but it's a legal text, and it just, sweeps away that impediment. But I'm going to give you an overview of what that license entitles. And if you do want to take a look at it, feel free. That license is open source. You can find it on our GitHub, the DB Systel space. So you can take a deeper look at it after the talk. What that license does, it brings the 4 freedoms of open source into the Deutsche Bahn Group. That is, the use of the software within the DB group is free of restrictions. The source code is available to everyone. Users can modify the software independently to make adjustments and improvements. And the modified versions of that code can be passed on to others. And also, that is a decision that was made for the license. It is a copyleft license, so that means if you do modify the source code, you also have to reshare it under the DB-ISL license. There is also an InnerSource pattern for this license. You can take a look at the InnerSource Commons patterns to read more about it. What we've noticed after we've put that license into place, that while now there is a legal document, it still often wasn't clear in a project if that license can be used or not, because you have to imagine that the DB Systel has a contract with, for example, the DB Fernverkehr. They actually move the trains, which is our main business. And if it's not part of that contract, it's not clear if it's okay to use the license. So a second thing that we did, we have a contract toolkit for service systems. So our account manager, negotiates a contract with a customer, and this is in there now. So it's a simple yes or no, or select, deselect in that contract module. The client is in agreement with the internal corporate use of the developed software components under the DB InnerSource license by other companies within the group. And if that is selected, then it's really easy for the developers to just do it. And if it's not selected, then at least there is clarity about that, and that it's not okay to use or to write InnerSource software within the project. Okay, so much for the first impediment, the separate business enterprises. And the second impediment is CI infrastructure costs money. We are a profit center, and that means that if you want to do something, use services, you have to pay for it. And paying for it, of course, means you need to have a cost center, which is not a problem if you're in a project. So if you just work on a project, then you have a cost center for that project, and you can order infrastructure and internal services. But why is that a problem for InnerSource? Let's take a look at how InnerSource problems can actually be created. And the first part is, and we've explicitly have those two terms within our InnerSource movement. The first one is team maintained InnerSource. That means we have a team, they own a product and work on that product. And that product may use one or multiple libraries. And those libraries could be InnerSource. So the team decided to share them, maybe to accept contributions. This is a quite natural way of doing InnerSource within a company. It means the team maintains that library and the existing infrastructure can be used. So we don't have an obstacle with costs for the infrastructure. But there's a really important second way of creating an InnerSource project. And it's what we call a community maintained InnerSource. It means a bunch of people maintain a library. And these people are the maintainers, and they can belong to different teams. They might have met as part of a hackathon, a bar camp, or just a community chat in one of our multiple communities. I told you we moved to a network organization. So we have a lot of networking going on all kinds of aspects of the software development stack. In principle, it could also start with a single maintainer that has an idea in his head and wants to see if it works. Now, of course, the idea is that maybe the product from a team also uses this library that's community maintained. Now, if we take a look at those, we see a few ups and downs for community maintained versus team maintained. So there's not one thing that's generally better than the other, but the upside of community maintained projects is that they are independent from the product lifecycle. So if at some point in time the product goes out of service, the libraries aren't necessarily need to go down. It's also independent of the organizational development of a team. You know, what happens if the team decides to split? What happens with the InnerSource library then? It's really easy to integrate collaborators, which is harder for team-maintained software because usually a team already has maybe a Jira to work on issues and they have a sprint, and it's not quite as easy to integrate collaborators in that setting. And also an impediment could be that you need maybe commitment from the entire team if you want to start an InnerSource library, which you don't need if it's community maintained. You know, a single person from the team can go out, look for other people that have the same problem, and go ahead and create a library. Now, the upside for team maintained is, as I already said, the funding is clear and the infrastructure and tooling are available. So this is a problem for the community maintained projects. And we filled this gap because we, as a topic team, said, okay, let's create infrastructure for InnerSource projects. And we call it the InnerSource Hub as basically a platform for InnerSource projects. It consists of a central GitLab group, or actually a few central GitLab groups for community maintained InnerSource projects. They have free CI pipelines and artifact repositories. Free, not really meaning free, but they are centrally funded. So you, as a maintainer of InnerSource, do not need to think about the funding of that infrastructure. It's a simple setup, so you can get started in minutes. And we, as the InnerSource topic team, are the maintainer of that hub. And also very important, we have a Teams channel as a central contact point. So it's always clear on where to discuss problems and also ideas for improvement. Okay, so now we have solved the legal problem and we have the necessary infrastructure in place. Surely we could expect that everyone is now doing InnerSource. Or what do you think could still be standing in the way? I would say I would call it fear. The developer is now asking, are we allowed to do that in our project? Is that what the company wants? And while the legal aspects are kind of clear, it's still a question of, should we really do it? And do we have the courage to start sharing our code? And to overcome that, we created an architectural principle. And I told you that the topic team, InnerSource, is part of the architecture guild at the DB Systel. And the Architectures Guild is a governance organization that has a mandate to regulate everything related to software and system architecture. So what we did with this architectural principle, we flipped the default. Now, as a team, you need a reason why not to do InnerSource in your project. And that really is meant as a help for the developers to assure them that this is what the company wants. It reduces the uncertainty to get started with InnerSource. And basically what we do is we use inertia to our advantage. Now, again, does that mean everyone does InnerSource? Of course not, as it is with governance, especially in a network organization, we obviously won't have 100% there. But still, what we could see is that a lot more teams started to follow this principle to actually share their repositories in read-only mode. And it goes on, this is just a snippet, it goes on to tell you that you need to use the DB InnerSource license on the code so that it can actually be reused. All right, so we cleared away those three impediments to separate business enterprises, CI infrastructure costing money, and inertia and uncertainty. And we as a topic team now continue to grow the InnerSource hub and collect feedback. And as a next step, I want to give you a glimpse into our InnerSource projects, because until now you had to believe me that we actually do InnerSource, and I do want to show you now. And so I've picked 4 projects. Let's start with the first one. You can see at the top right, this is a community maintained project. So I've picked 2 out of those categories each. And I'm going to start with the DB container lib, which is a collection of Docker files and images. They are built for production, and we see a great variety of distributions, Linux distributions, and tools available that you need for running your services in production. The employee of the month actually is Renovate, because obviously we'll need a lot of patching, and we have high standards of patch management for our production services. What kind of patterns do we see here? First of all, we have a very large user base. Lots of people using the DB container lib and lots of the projects. To give you an idea what that means, the Java base images alone, they have approximately 700,000 downloads per year, probably rising. And this is rather not suitable for open source because we have lots of DB customizations. DB meaning Deutsche Bahn, of course, not database. We have certificates, we have things for sys benchmarks, we have label conventions. They are not really useful for the open source world. We do also have a dedicated Teams channel for communication just for the base images, because there's the need for it to have discussions about the way those images are set up. The question, do we need another image with another distribution or maybe another variant? And so we've created a separate Teams channel. So what kind of qualities do we see here? We obviously see cost reduction on a major scale. We have lots of teams doing Dockerized applications, and they don't all need to take care of writing base images, which will also be hard because not everyone is an OCI expert, right? So a container expert, and it's a lot better to have those, which brings me to increased quality, because bringing in all the people with different backgrounds, Linux experts, also maybe Java, Node, Python experts, and bringing them together on those base images really increases the quality. And last but not least, of course, we see a culture of collaboration, because people across projects actually contribute, and also not only across projects, but across companies. I told you about the 500 subsidiaries. We at the DB Systel aren't the only people at the Deutsche Bahn group that work on software. So we also have contributions from other parts of the group, which I personally think is a really good thing and something that we want to increase even more in the future. And here's a glimpse into it. You can take a look. I obviously do not have a URL for you because this is InnerSource, not open source. But you can see, Node, Java, Python, Debian, .NET, Amazon Linux, and so on and so on. We could scroll down here to see other projects as well. But you can see there's quite some activity in this group. Okay, let's look at the second project. This is a team-maintained project. It's called Pipeship, and it's a set of modular GitLab CI pipelines. It consists of about 200 modules, at least last time I checked, and it is maintained by a platform team, and they have a support business model, which means using this software is free, but they sell support, which fits really well with the DBISL, of course, because if you need to pay for using the software, the GitLab CI pipelines, then you couldn't really apply the DBISL license. What kind of patterns do we see? We see bug fixing and features directly by user teams. The issues are transparent, and there is a contribution guideline, so contributions are very welcome. And this team actually is a heavy contributor to the DB container lib because, well, we have CI pipelines, also CD pipelines, which are about deployment. And so the base images are also very valuable for the team Pipeship. We see two main qualities here. It's an increase in quality because user feedback is directly incorporated with issues and merge requests. And this is also important from the point of the adopters, not only for the team itself, because if you ever have a problem with your pipeline, you are able to take a look into the code. And if it's important for you, you can fix it right away. You don't even have to wait until it is merged. You can just use your forked version, which is also a typical open source pattern. You can unblock yourself, but you can still contribute back to upstream. So once it is merged, you go back to the main line and you get patches again. And of course, we have a culture of collaboration. So the next project we have is the K8S setup. Again, this is a community maintained project, and it is an infrastructure of code setup, which uses Helm file, which is a tool to deploy multiple Helm charts. And it helps you set up your Kubernetes namespace. So we have quite a few tools that you want in your usual Kubernetes namespace, like monitoring and secret management things. It has dependencies to quite some other Deutsche Bahn internal tools and rule sets. And it is divided into two parts. So it has a base project with all the logic and the description. And then it has a fork me project, which just consists of a README file and some values to customize the deployment. It is used as a tool by our DevOps coaches. So we have an enabling team that goes, from team to team, helping them to get started with the DevOps methodology and tools. And this is a great base for that because you can get started in, let's say, hours. What do we see? What patterns do we see? We see that the forks serve as a great example for your own fork. So not only do you have the original ForkMe project, but through the use of the GitLab feature, you can browse through the other forks and see how other teams set up their Kubernetes namespace. Those forks are, again, InnerSource, thanks to the copyleft of the DBISL. And the users participate through issues and merge requests. To be honest, more through issues than merge requests, because again, not everyone is an expert in Helm file description files, especially teams just getting started with Kubernetes and Dockerized applications. What qualities do we see? Well, we see cost reduction again, because before we had this project setting up Kubernetes namespaces with everything that you need to get started, it took days, especially for the unexperienced teams. And now really it's a matter of a few hours to get everything set up on your local machine, to actually deploy these things and to learn the basics of the tools of Helm and Helm file. And then you do Helm file apply and you have everything set up in your namespace. And of course, we see culture of collaboration, especially between the DevOps coaches and the teams using it, but also with other people creating issues and discussions in the issues. Let's get to the last example that I have selected. This is something maybe that you don't think about when you hear InnerSource, because we think about code. But documentation, if you use the docs as code pattern, also fits in quite well. And so the microsite of the Architecture Guild, I think, is a great example of why it's really helpful to do InnerSource. It consists of the binding rules and non-binding recommendations, and it's actually based on an open source tool, the doc toolchain, thanks to my colleague Ralph. He's the maintainer of that. Now, what kind of patterns do we see? The changes can be tracked quite transparently in the commit history, since it's all in version control. The affected teams, which is basically every delivery team at the DB Systel, they can suggest phrasing improvements directly via merge request. In principle, of course, they could also come up with whole new regulations and things like that. That really hasn't happened yet, I think, which is quite okay. There are other formats to discuss that. But if you see like an error or a broken link in the documentation, it's quite easy to suggest a fix. And the Architecture Guild has an SLA for the response to issues and merge requests, and they say we take a maximum of 1 week to merge something if it's mergeable, or to give feedback if it's not. So obviously the main quality that we see here is transparency, because the Architecture Guild is a group of a few people that work on regulations for the whole company, and they can do it in a transparent and open way. We also see a culture of collaboration because the teams that are affected by this, they can directly collaborate with the people that write the regulations. All right, so now a question you could ask, now that we've seen the InnerSource project, is why not directly start as open source? And to be honest, when I joined the company 8 years ago, that was what I thought when I first heard of InnerSource. I thought, why do we need that? I was coming from small companies before, and it sounded logical to me to, just open source code that you want to share. And while that might be a point for some projects, there's also a few factors discouraging immediate release as an open source project. One, again, and we heard that already, is developer uncertainty. But it's another kind of insecurity. If you actually make an open source project, it could be quite scary because anyone, including your future employer maybe, or your mother, could read the code. And it's a big leap when maybe previously only your own team members could read the software, and you're just not used to having your code open. Another aspect could be that you have trade secrets that you really don't want to reveal, maybe about your own topology, if it's security relevant, or maybe just because you think this is your unique selling point and you just should not share it. Another one could be that you have some projects that could be heavily dependent on internal infrastructure or regulations, where there's just not a lot of value to using it outside the Deutsche Bahn railroad context. But still, InnerSource can really serve as a bridge to open source. Once a project becomes InnerSource, it could be more easily developed into an open source project because people can get used to building it in a way that they are good with sharing it even further. And I've brought an example. I don't know if you've ever heard of Borg, which is a Google project or was a Google project. You might not have heard of it, and that's okay. I'm really, really sure you've heard of Kubernetes. And Borg actually was an InnerSource project as Google, meant for deployment of containerized applications, orchestration of those. And later they have rewritten it and open sources at Kubernetes. So here really Borg was the incubator for Kubernetes, and they learned a lot of it. And a lot of the same developers actually worked on Kubernetes. And today it's a project with over 3,000 contributors and quite successful. I have a second example, which originated in the Deutsche Bahn. It is DBUI, and you can find it on GitHub, of course. Now we're back to open source, github.com, DBUI. It has its own space. It's also a set of projects. We can take a look at it here. And it's basically our design system and reusable components within that. And that really makes a lot of sense. First, you might think, why is the Deutsche Bahn design system interesting? But we have quite a few external agencies and partners who develop products for us. And in the past, it actually has happened that they started from scratch because they simply didn't know that design tokens and components existed. But also, it can serve as a lesson for other companies on how to actually solve the problem of building a design system which is modular. And it really enables a great exchange at community meetings and conferences because we can share and view the code and talk about it in detail, which we won't do now in this conference call, of course, but it happened at other conferences, and the colleagues that worked on this were able to really talk about what they did. All right, so that brings me to the end. And if you're interested in more, probably most of you know it, but if you don't, let's take a look at the InnerSource Commons website. There are a lot of patterns on there, a few of the things that we've talked about here, but also patterns from other companies brought into here. So browse them if you want to learn more about InnerSource patterns. So with that, I say thank you very much for listening. You can reach out to me on the channels that I present here. And also, if you want to take a look at the slides again and a little more background information, you can take a look at our blog, The Tech Stories of Systel. And for that, I'm really happy to have some time for discussion and questions. Thank you so much.